Dublin, a bustling Viking city in the heart of medieval Ireland. But beneath the veneer of trade and prosperity lies a dark secret, a thriving slave trade that fueled the city's growth and connected it to a vast network of human trafficking across Europe and beyond. This series explores the harrowing realities of slavery in Viking Age Dublin, drawing on archaeological discoveries, historical accounts, and expert analysis. We'll investigate the origins of the slaves, their living conditions, their roles in society, and the moral implications of this brutal praxis in Viking Age Dublin. The Emerald Isle of Ireland. The Emerald Isle of Ireland, in the 9th century AD, a land of rolling green hills, ancient monasteries, and a burgeoning Christian faith. But a storm is brewing on the horizon. Carried on the winds from the north, long ships, sleek and menacing, appear, filled with warriors who will forever alter the course of Irish history. This is the Viking invasion of Dublin, a brutal chapter marked by bloodshed and enslavement and the rise of a new power in the land. The Vikings, hailing from Scandinavia, were not strangers to Ireland. For decades, they had been raiding coastal settlements and monasteries, striking fear into the heart of the Irish. But now, their ambition has grown. They seek not just plunder, but a permanent foothold, a strategic base from which to dominate trade and to project their power. The Annals of Ulster, a chronicle of medieval Irish history, record a chilling entry for the year 841 AD. They write, "The foreigners still on the Boyne, and they proceeded to Dublin and made a slaughter there." Patrick Wallace, in his comprehensive study of Viking Dublin, paints a vivid picture of the violence that accompanied the Viking arrival. He writes, "The archaeological evidence for the initial Viking settlement of Dublin reveals a period of intense conflict and destruction. We find evidence of burning, skeletal remains with trauma consistent with warfare, and the disruption of the existing Irish settlement." The Vikings, masters of warfare, descended upon Dublin with ruthless efficiency. Their longships, swift and maneuverable, allowed them to penetrate deep into the Liffey estuary, taking the defenders by surprise. Armed with axes, swords, and spears, they overwhelmed the Irish, leaving a trail of death and destruction in their wake. The Cogad Gaidal Regailaiv, a 12th century Irish account of the Viking Wars, describes the brutality of the invaders. They write, "They spread themselves over the whole of Ireland, and they wrought vast havoc and devastation, plundering and burning churches and forts, and slaying and enslaving men and women without mercy." Donchad O'Corraine, in his seminal work Ireland and the Vikings, explains the impact of these raids. He writes, "The Viking raids were a traumatic experience for the Irish. They shattered the relative peace and prosperity of the early Christian period, leaving a legacy of fear and instability. The Vikings were not content with merely killing and plundering. They also sought to enslave the Irish, taking captives to be sold in Dublin's slave market. Men, women, and children were rounded up and forced into servitude, destined for a life of hardship and exploitation." Arman Jakobsson, in his study of slavery in the Viking world, called Slavery in Medieval Scandinavia, highlights the brutality of the practice. He writes, "Slavery was an integral part of Viking Age society. Slaves were acquired through raiding, warfare, and trade, and they played a variety of roles in the economy and social structure. However, it is important to remember that slavery was a dehumanizing and exploitative institution, and the lives of slaves were often filled with hardship and suffering." The slave trade quickly became a lucrative business in Dublin. The city's strategic location, with access to the Irish Sea and the interior of Ireland, made it an ideal hub for the trafficking of human beings. Slaves were sold to Viking settlers, Irish elites, and even international traders, fueling the city's economic growth and connecting it to a vast network of human exploitation. James Barrett, in the book Viking Age Economics and Society, discusses the economic significance of the slave trade. He writes, "Slavery played a vital role in the Viking Age economy. Slaves provided a source of cheap labor, and they were also traded as valuable commodities. The slave trade contributed significantly to the wealth and prosperity of Viking settlements like Dublin." Having secured their foothold in Dublin, the Vikings set about establishing a permanent settlement. They built houses, workshops, and defensive fortifications, They established a thriving marketplace, attracting traders from across the Viking world and beyond. But why did they choose to settle in Dublin? What made this location so desirable? Howard Clarke, in his exploration of Dublin's history called Dublin, the Bridge Between the Isles, argues that Dublin's strategic location at the intersection of several important trade routes made it a prime location for the Vikings. They could control the flow of goods between Ireland, Britain, and Scandinavia, and use the city as a base for further expansion. Dublin quickly became a hub of international trade. Goods from across Europe and beyond flowed through its bustling marketplace. Furs, timber, and slaves from the east, silver, weapons, and textiles from the west. The city's wealth grew, attracting more settlers and reinforcing its position as a major Viking power center. The Cogad Gaidil Regallaib, a historical account of the Viking Wars in Ireland, describes Dublin as a great city and a strong fortress, full of wealth and merchandise, and a haven for ships from all parts. Somerville and MacDonald, in their analysis of Viking expansion and settlements, write, "The establishment of Dublin was a key moment in the development of the Viking world. It provided a strategic base for further conquests and trade, and it contributed to the emergence of a powerful Viking kingdom in Ireland." The Viking invasion of Dublin was a watershed moment in Irish history. It marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the Vikings would play a dominant role in the island's political and cultural landscape. The violence and bloodshed that accompanied their arrival left a deep scar on the Irish psyche, but it also set in motion a process of cultural exchange and adaptation that would shape the future of Ireland. The Viking invasion of Dublin was a brutal and transformative event in Irish history. But the violence didn't end with the initial conquest. The establishment of a Viking stronghold in Dublin led to a dramatic increase in raiding and warfare across the island, fueling a slave trade that would have devastating consequences for the Irish people. The Vikings, with their superior weaponry and ruthless tactics, were a formidable force. They launched lightning raids on monasteries, settlements, and even royal centers, leaving a trail of destruction and despair in their wake. Their primary objective was plunder, gold, silver, and other valuables, but they also sought another valuable commodity: slaves. The Annals of Ulster, a chronicle of medieval Irish history, paint a grim picture of the Viking raids. They write, 845 AD, the heathens still in Dublin, a great slaughter of the Irish by the foreigners throughout all Ireland this year. These terse entries reveal the frequency and brutality of the Viking attacks. Duncad O'Corraine, in his seminal work Ireland and the Vikings, explains the impact of these raids. He writes, "The Viking raids were a traumatic experience for the Irish. They shattered the relative peace and prosperity of the early Christian period, leaving a legacy of fear and instability. The Vikings showed no mercy in their pursuit of slaves. Men, women, and children were captured, torn from their homes and families, and forced into a life of servitude. The sagas and chronicles are filled with accounts of these raids, detailing the suffering and despair of the enslaved. The Cogad Cadel Recalaib, a 12th century Irish account of the Viking Wars, describes the capture and enslavement of the Irish. It says, "They carried off a great number of captives, both men and women, and brought them to Dublin to be sold as slaves." In the book The Viking Diaspora, James Graham Campbell writes, "The slave trade was an integral part of the Viking economy. Slaves were not only a source of labor, but also a valuable commodity that could be traded for other goods." Dublin's slave market became a hub of human trafficking, connecting the city to a vast network of trade routes that stretched across Europe and beyond. Slaves from Ireland were sold to Viking settlers in Dublin, to Irish elites, and even to traders from Scandinavia, Britain, and the continent. Paul Holm, in his detailed analysis of the Dublin slave trade, writes, "Dublin was a major entrepot for slaves in the Viking Age. The city's strategic location and its extensive trade networks made it a key hub for the trafficking of human beings." The impact of the Viking slave trade on Ireland was profound. It not only caused immense suffering and loss, but also disrupted the social and economic fabric of Irish society. Families were torn apart, communities were destabilized, and a climate of fear and insecurity prevailed. Daibi Oikroinin, in his comprehensive history of early medieval Ireland called Early Medieval Ireland 400 to 1200, writes, "The Viking raids and the slave trade had a devastating impact on Irish society. They disrupted the existing political and social order, and they contributed to a period of instability and conflict that lasted for centuries. The Viking slave trade was a dark and brutal chapter in Irish history. It is a reminder of the human cost of conflict and the enduring legacy of exploitation and injustice. The slave trade in Viking Dublin was a brutal reality, a dark stain on the city's history. But what was life like for those who were captured and sold into servitude? What were their daily experiences like, and how did they cope with the loss of freedom, family, and homeland? The archaeological record provides glimpses into the harsh realities of slavery in Dublin. Excavations have uncovered the remains of slave quarters, often cramped and poorly constructed dwellings located on the outskirts of the main settlement. These findings suggest that slaves were segregated from the free population, living in conditions of poverty and deprivation. Lindsay Simpson, in her detailed study of the archaeological evidence for slavery in Dublin, writes, "The slave quarters that have been excavated in Dublin paint a bleak picture of life for the enslaved. These dwellings were often small, dark, and poorly ventilated, with little in the way of comfort or amenities. The archaeological evidence suggests that slaves were subjected to harsh living conditions and a lack of basic necessities. Analysis of food remains and human skeletons from Dublin provides further insights into the diet and health of the enslaved. Their diet was often meager and monotonous, consisting mainly of basic staples like barley, oats, and fish. Skeletal evidence reveals signs of malnutrition, disease, and physical trauma, suggesting that slaves endured harsh labor and poor health." Catherine Batt, in her analysis of the skeletal remains from Dublin, notes, "The skeletal evidence from Dublin reveals a stark contrast between the health of the free population and that of the enslaved. Slaves often exhibit signs of malnutrition, disease, and physical trauma, indicating a life of hardship and deprivation." The Cogad Gadil Regalib, a 12th century Irish account of the Viking Wars, called The War of the Irish with the Foreigners, translated, describes the harsh treatment of slaves. In the literature, it says, "The foreigners were harsh and cruel masters, and they treated their slaves with great severity. They forced them to labor without rest, and they punished them severely for any transgressions." Slaves in Dublin performed a wide range of tasks. They were employed in domestic service, agriculture, construction, and craft production. Some slaves were even trained as warriors, fighting alongside their Viking masters in raids and battles. James Barrett, in the book Viking Age Economics and Society, discusses the diverse roles of slaves. He writes, "Slaves were an integral part of the Viking Age economy. They provided a source of cheap labor, and they were employed in a wide range of activities, from domestic service and agriculture to skilled crafts and warfare." In the book called The Viking World, by James Graham Campbell and Neil Price, the authors write, "Slaves were the property of their owners and could be treated as their owners saw fit. Punishments for disobedience or perceived infractions could be severe, including beatings, mutilation, or even death." The Icelandic sagas, while often fiction, also offer glimpses into the treatment of slaves. In these sagas, slaves are sometimes depicted as being subject to physical and emotional abuse at the hands of their masters. In the saga of the people of Laxardal, a slave named Geirtoft is brutally beaten by his master Bolli for a minor offense. This scene, though perhaps fictional, may reflect the harsh realities of slavery in the Viking Age. Geirtoft, a slave owned by Bolli Thorleiksson, a prominent chieftain, is involved in a minor dispute with another man named Gudrun. The argument escalates, and Geirtoft strikes Gudrun with a stick. Here comes a quote from the Laxdala saga. "Geirtoft struck at Gudrun with a big stick he was carrying and caught him above the elbow. This blow was so hard that the arm was broken. Bolli, upon learning of this, is enraged. He sees this not just as an injury to his kinsman, but as an act of defiance by a slave. He orders Geirtoft to be seized and punished. Bolli had Geirtoft seized and taken to a small island out in the lake. There he had him bound to a post with his bare back turned outwards. Then he had him flogged until the flesh was stripped from his bones." The saga doesn't shy away from the brutality of the punishment. Geirtoft is flogged so severely that the flesh is stripped from his back. He is left on the island, exposed to the elements, to die a slow and agonizing death. In the Laxdala saga, they write, "Geirtoft was left there for a long time, and no one tended to his wounds. He died there on the island, and his body was never recovered." This incident, though fictional, perhaps, highlights the absolute power that Viking masters held over their slaves. Gaitov's punishment was disproportionate to his offense, driven by Bolli's anger and his desire to assert his dominance. It serves as a reminder of the vulnerability of slaves and the potential for abuse within this system. As Stefan Brink notes in the book Slavery in the Viking Age, he writes, "The legal and social status of slaves in the Viking world placed them entirely at the mercy of their owners. While there were some customary limitations on the treatment of slaves, ultimately a master could punish a slave as they saw fit, even to the point of death." The story of Gertov's punishment is a disturbing one, but it's important to acknowledge these darker aspects of Viking history. While not every slave experienced such brutality, the potential for abuse was inherent in the slave system. Despite the hardships they faced, slaves in Dublin found ways to maintain their humanity and resist their captivity. They formed communities, shared their cultural traditions, and even found ways to express their defiance through music, art, and religion. In the book The Archaeology of Slavery, Jolanda Moses, the author, writes, "Even in the face of oppression and dehumanization, enslaved people found ways to maintain their cultural identity and resist their captivity. They created their own communities, preserved their traditions, and found ways to express their humanity through music, art, and religion." While the archaeological and historical record provides glimpses into the lives of slaves in Dublin, it's important to remember that their experiences were diverse and complex. Some slaves may have endured unimaginable hardship and cruelty, while others may have found ways to negotiate their position within Viking society and even gain a degree of autonomy. Stefan Brink, in his comprehensive study of slavery called Slavery in the Viking Age, writes, "The lives of slaves were undoubtedly difficult, but they were not uniform. Some slaves may have experienced extreme hardship and brutality, while others may have enjoyed a relatively comfortable existence, depending on their masters, their skills, and their roles in society." The daily realities of slavery in Dublin were harsh and unforgiving, but even in the face of oppression and dehumanization, the enslaved found ways to maintain their humanity, resist their captivity, and preserve their cultural identity. Their stories, though often hidden in the shadows of history, are a testament to the enduring strength and resilience of the human spirit. Dublin, in the 10th century, was a thriving Viking city, a hub of trade and commerce. But beneath the veneer of prosperity lay a dark secret, a bustling slave market, a place where human beings were bought and sold like commodities. Imagine the scene, a crowded marketplace, filled with the sights, sounds, and smells of human misery. Captured men, women, and children, stripped of their dignity, displayed for inspection like livestock. Viking merchants, Irish elites, and international traders, all eager to acquire the human chattel that fueled the city's economy. Howard Clark, in his exploration of Dublin's history, in the book Dublin, The Bridge Between the Isles, describes the slave markets as a place of intense human drama, where the desperation of the enslaved met the cold calculations of the traders. It was a stark reminder of the brutal realities of Viking Age society. The location of the slave market in Dublin remains a subject of debate among historians and archaeologists. Some believe it was located near the river, where ships could easily unload their human cargo. Others suggest it was situated within the fortified settlement, perhaps in a designated area near the marketplace. John Sheehan, in his analysis of trade in Viking Dublin, in the book called The Archaeology of Trade in Viking Age Dublin, writes, "The slave market was likely a well-organized and regulated institution, with designated areas for the display and sale of slaves. It would have been a prominent feature of the city's commercial landscape." The slave trade in Dublin was a complex and multifaceted operation. Viking raiders, Irish kings and chieftains, and international traders all played a role in supplying the market with its human cargo. Slaves were acquired through warfare, raiding, and even kidnapping. A 12th century Irish account of the Viking Wars, called The War of the Irish with the Foreigners, describes the capture and enslavement of the Irish. It says, "The foreigners carried off a great number of captives, both men and women, and brought them to Dublin to be sold as slaves." In the academic source, called Viking Dublin, Trial Pieces, Patrick Wallace writes, "The slave trade was a major factor in the growth and prosperity of Dublin. It provided a source of cheap labor for the city's economy, and it also generated significant revenue through the sale of slaves to other Viking settlements and to international traders." The buyers of slaves in Dublin were diverse. Viking settlers acquired slaves for domestic service, agricultural labor, and craft production. Irish elites also purchased slaves, often to enhance their own status and power. and international traders transported slaves to other parts of the Viking world, including Scandinavia, Britain, and the continent. Else Rosdahl, in the book The Cambridge Illustrated History of the Vikings, writes, "The slave trade was an integral part of the Viking economy. Slaves were traded across vast distances, connecting Scandinavia to the British Isles, the continent, and even the Middle East. The human cost of the Dublin slave trade was immense. Those who were enslaved endured the trauma of capture, the horrors of transportation, and the dehumanizing experience of being sold in the marketplace. They faced a life of servitude, separated from their families and communities, their futures uncertain." In the book The Archaeology of Slavery, James Dietz, in his chapter called Material Culture and Archaeology of Slavery, writes, "The archaeological record of slavery is often silent on the emotional and psychological trauma experienced by the enslaved. However, we can infer from the material remains the harsh conditions they endured and the challenges they faced in maintaining their humanity and cultural identity. The slave market in Dublin was a hub of human trafficking, a place where the brutality of the Viking Age was on full display. It was a source of wealth and prosperity for the city, but it also cast a long shadow of suffering and exploitation. Let's have a look at how the slave trade likely happened in Dublin. The auctioneer, likely a Viking with a commanding voice and a keen eye for profit, would present each slave to the crowd. He would highlight their physical attributes, their skills, and their potential value to a buyer. The slaves, stripped and prodded, would be forced to endure the humiliation of public inspection. Though from Iceland, the Grogos law code offers insights into the legal status of slaves and how they might have been treated in a marketplace like in Dublin. It states, "A slave who is for sale shall be washed and clad in good clothes, so that his faults may be seen." This suggests an attempt to present slaves in the best possible light, though the underlying dehumanization remains. Buyers would likely examine the slave, assessing their strength, health, and potential usefulness. Bids would be made, prices negotiated, and deals struck. The slaves, powerless to resist, would be handed over to their new owners, their fate uncertain. While focused on England, the book Viking Age England by Sawyer sheds light on the type of transactions common in Viking slave markets. He writes, "Payment for slaves could be made in various forms, including silver, goods, or even other slaves. The price of a slave varied depending on their age, health, and skills. The emotional and psychological trauma experienced by those enslaved and sold in the Dublin market is unimaginable. Torn from their families and homes, stripped of their identity and freedom, they faced a future of hardship." Dublin, a thriving Viking city in the heart of medieval Ireland, a hub of trade, culture, and slavery. The Annals of the Four Masters, a chronicle of Irish history, frequently mention Dublin as a center for the slave trade, with entries like this from the year 821 AD. The Vikings still continued to plunder and burn the churches of Ireland, and they carried off many prisoners, both men and women, into captivity. These captives, often taken during raids on monasteries and settlements, would be transported to Dublin and sold in its bustling slave markets. Slavery in Dublin was a harsh reality. Slaves were seen as commodities, chattels to be bought, sold, and exploited, as described by historian Arman Jakobsson in his work Slavery in Medieval Scandinavia. They endured grueling labor, from domestic chores to agricultural work, and even skilled crafts. But even in this oppressive environment, the spirit of resistance flickered. Forms of resistance were varied. The Icelandic sagas, though often romanticized, provide some insight into the methods employed by slaves. In the Laxdala saga, a slave named Melkorka, captured in Ireland, feigns illnesses to avoid work, then secretly maintains her native language. Such acts of defiance, though small, preserved a sense of identity and challenged the control of their masters. Other forms of resistance included sabotage, deliberately breaking tools, ruining crops, or spoiling food to disrupt the routines of their masters and inflict economic damage. Theft, stealing small items of value, both as a form of protest and to acquire resources that might aid in escape. Feigning ignorance, pretending not to understand instruction, to slow down work or cause frustration. Maintaining cultural traditions, secretly practicing their religion, singing songs from their homeland, or telling stories to keep their cultural heritage alive. Petty theft was another form of resistance. The Kogad Gadelle Regaleb, an Irish account of the Viking Wars, mentions slaves stealing from their masters, sometimes as a means to acquire resources for escape. Escape was the ultimate act of defiance. Dublin, being a coastal city, presented opportunities for flight. In his book, The Slave Trade of Dublin, historian Paul Holm describes how some slaves attempted to stow away on ships, hoping to reach their homeland or find refuge elsewhere. Holm notes that escaping slaves often faced immense challenges. They had to contend with not only the physical dangers of the journey, but also the constant threat of recapture. Many were likely caught and returned to their masters, facing severe punishment. Archaeological evidence, though scarce, provides tantalizing hints of resistance. In Dublin, excavations have uncovered narrow tunnels and hidden passages beneath Viking dwellings. While their purpose is debated, it's possible these were used by slaves attempting to escape in tunnels. These hidden spaces tell a story of desperation and defiance. Imagine the courage it would have taken to attempt such an escape, knowing the risks involved. One compelling account of a successful escape comes from Life of St. Patrick. Although this source is written centuries later, it describes Patrick's escape from slavery in Ireland. He fled his master, walking nearly 200 miles to the coast, enduring hunger, exhaustion, and the constant fear of capture. He describes this harrowing journey in his own words, and says, "And after a few years I was again in Britain with my parents, and they welcomed me as a son, and asked me in faith that after the great tribulations I had endured, I should not go anywhere else away from them." Eventually, he found passage on a ship back to Britain, where he was reunited with his family. While Patrick's story is unique, it highlights the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring hope for freedom. Here's a more detailed look at the story of the Irish slaves who escaped in Iceland, as recounted in the Book of Settlements. This episode takes place in the late 9th century, during the early period of Icelandic settlement. A Norse chieftain named Hromarsson, along with his crew, which included Irish slaves, arrived in Iceland seeking land and a new life. However, they faced hardship and conflict, including a struggle for resources with another group of settlers. In a desperate situation, with their provisions dwindling, Hromarsson and his men went out hunting. Seizing this opportunity, the Irish slaves revolted. They killed Hromarsson and his men, took possession of their boat, and escaped to a group of islands off the coast of Iceland, known as the Westman Islands. The text suggests that the slaves were driven by hunger and desperation, as well as a desire for freedom. They had been subjected to harsh treatment and saw a chance to escape their oppressive conditions. The slaves acted decisively, killing their masters and taking their boat while they were away. This suggests a level of planning and coordination. The slaves established a short-lived settlement on the Westman Islands. However, they were eventually discovered and killed by Ingolfur Arnarsson, another Norse settler who sought revenge for the death of his foster brother Hromarsson. The resistance of slaves in Dublin, though often hidden from the official records, left an indelible mark on the city's history. Their struggles, their defiance, and their yearning for freedom serve as a powerful reminder of the human cost of slavery and the enduring strength of the human spirit. In the world of the Vikings, law and order were paramount. Their society, though often perceived as chaotic and violent, was governed by a complex system of laws and customs. These laws, passed down orally for generations, were eventually codified in texts like the Icelandic Grógós, or Grey Goose laws translated. And within these legal frameworks, we find a stark reality. The institution of slavery was not only recognized, but also regulated. The Grógós, compiled in the 12th century, provides a window into the legal status of slaves in Viking society. It defines slaves as those who are lawfully owned by another, clearly establishing their status as property. This legal definition stripped slaves of their personhood and rendered them subject to the will of their masters. Slaves were considered chattels, much like livestock or land. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or given as gifts. The Grógós outlines the rights of slave owners, stating that a man has full right over his slave, to sell him or keep him as he wishes. This absolute power granted to slave owners highlights the dehumanizing nature of slavery within Viking society. The law was indeed harsh. Slaves had limited legal protections. They could be punished severely for offenses against their masters, including theft, disobedience, or even attempted escape. The Grógós details various punishments, stating that if a slave steals from his master, he shall be punished according to the value of the stolen goods, even unto death. However, the law also placed some limitations on the treatment of slaves. While owners had considerable power, they were not allowed to kill their slaves without just cause. The Grogos states that if a master kills a slave without lawful reason, he must pay a vergild, which means compensation, to the slave's kin. This provision, while offering some protection, still treated slaves as property with a monetary value attached to their lives. The legal system also recognized certain limited rights for slaves. For instance, they could own some personal property, though it remained under the control of their masters. In certain circumstances, they could testify in court, though their testimony was often considered less reliable than that of a free person. The Grogos outlines the process of manumission, whereby a slave could be granted freedom. This often involved a payment to the owner, either by the slave themselves or by a third party. If a man wishes to free his slave, he shall take him to the ting, which means assembly, and declare him a free man before witnesses. Freed slaves, while no longer chattels, still occupied a lower social status than freeborn individuals and faced limitations on their rights and opportunities. The legal framework surrounding slavery in Viking society was a complex one. It reflected the social and economic realities of the time, where slaves were an integral part of the workforce. While the law provided some limited protections, it ultimately reinforced the institution of slavery, denying basic human rights to a significant portion of the population. As historian David Wyatt observes, the legal codes of the Vikings, while offering glimpses of humanity, ultimately served to legitimize and perpetuate the brutal system of slavery. Dublin in the Viking Age was a melting pot of cultures and beliefs. The Norse, with their pagan traditions, brought with them the institution of slavery, deeply ingrained in their society. But alongside their gods and rituals, Christianity was beginning to take root, bringing with it a different set of values, ones that would challenge the very foundations of slavery. Christianity, with its emphasis on love, compassion, and the equality of all souls in the eyes of God, presented a stark contrast to the dehumanizing practice of slavery. Early Christian writers like St. Patrick, himself once a slave in Ireland, condemned the enslavement of fellow Christians. In his letter, called Letter to the Soldiers of Coroticus, Patrick denounces the capture and sale of Christian believers, calling it a wicked and unchristian act, and lamenting that the most ruthless enemies have carried off the baptized, the men and women of God, into captivity. The growing influence of Christianity in Dublin created a moral dilemma for both church leaders and Viking rulers. While the church condemned slavery in principle, it often had to navigate the realities of a society where slavery was deeply entrenched. Some church leaders, like Bishop Wulfstan of Worcester, actively preached against the slave trade, urging his congregation to not sell men like beasts. The church also offered spiritual solace to slaves, welcoming them into the Christian community and offering them the promise of salvation. This inclusion, while not directly challenging the institution of slavery, provided slaves with a sense of belonging and hope in the face of adversity. In his book called The Slave Trade of Dublin, Paul Holm notes that the church played a crucial role in integrating slaves into the Christian community, offering them a sense of spiritual equality and providing a platform for social interaction between slaves and free people. Religious texts and teachings often provided a source of inspiration and resistance for slaves. The Bible, with its stories of liberation and justice, offered hope for a better future. The story of Exodus, in which Moses leads the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, resonated deeply with those who longed for freedom. The Norse, with their pagan beliefs, had a different perspective on slavery. In Norse mythology, slaves were often associated with the underworld and the service of the gods. The Eddas, a collection of Norse poems, describe slaves accompanying their masters to the afterlife, continuing to serve them in Valhalla or Hell. Freya owns the hall Sessumnir, which is large and fair, and whenever she rides to battle, she takes half of the slain. This poem suggests that those who died in battle, including slaves, would continue to serve their masters in the afterlife. This belief system may have contributed to the acceptance of slavery in Viking society. It provided a religious justification for the practice, suggesting that slaves had a designated role in the cosmic order, even in the afterlife. However, some scholars argue that this interpretation is overly simplistic and that Norse attitudes towards slavery were more nuanced. The clash between Christian and pagan ideals created a fertile ground for moral and ethical debates about slavery. While some justified slavery as a necessary evil or a consequence of war, others challenged its morality, arguing that it contradicted the fundamental principles of human dignity and compassion. These debates, though often muted, reflected the growing tension between the old ways and the new, between the pagan past and the Christian present. As historian James Barrett observes, the arrival of Christianity in Viking Dublin introduced a new moral vocabulary that challenged the traditional justifications for slavery. This clash of ideologies would eventually contribute to the decline of slavery in Ireland and throughout the Norse world. For centuries, Dublin thrived as a major hub in the Viking slave trade. The cries of the enslaved echoed through its streets, and the clink of silver coins exchanged for human lives was a commonplace sound. But this dark chapter in its history eventually drew to a close. The decline of the slave trade in Dublin was a multifaceted process, woven from the threads of political upheaval, economic shifts, and evolving moral consciousness, a testament to the complex interplay of forces that shape our history. The 11th and 12th centuries witnessed a dramatic resurgence of the Irish kingdoms, fueled by a burning desire to reclaim their ancestral lands and cast off the yoke of Viking oppression. They rose up in defiance. The Coag Gaedel Galib vividly recounts the decisive victory of Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, over the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Brian urged his battalions to attack the foreigners with fierceness and impetuosity, and a countless number of the foreigners were cut off, the chronicle declares, emphasizing the magnitude of the Irish victory. This victory shattered Viking dominance, severely weakening their grip on Dublin and disrupting their slave-raiding networks. Simultaneously, a wave of Christianity swept through Scandinavia, carrying with it new ideas about human dignity and equality. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason of Norway actively championed the new faith, constructing churches, dispatching missionaries, and even resorting to force to convert his subjects. The Icelandic sagas recount Olaf's forceful conversion tactics, vividly describing how he threatened those who refused to accept Christianity with death or exile. Yet, these same sagas also highlight his unwavering opposition to slavery. It is wicked to sell men who have been baptized, Olaf declared, recognizing the inherent contradiction between Christian principles and the enslavement of fellow believers. This moral stance, combined with the active efforts of Christian missionaries, gradually eroded the acceptance of slavery within Norse society. The writings of early Christian leaders further reinforced this message of equality and compassion. In his letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul urges masters to treat their slaves with kindness and respect, reminding them that them too have a master in heaven. This emphasis on the shared humanity of all people, regardless of their social status, challenged the foundations of slavery and paved the way for its eventual decline. The Church actively promoted the manumission of slaves, meaning the freeing of slaves, offering spiritual rewards and social recognition to those who freed their human chattels. The Liber Vitae of Durham Cathedral, for example, records numerous instances of slaves being granted their freedom by their masters, often in association with religious ceremonies and acts of piety. The Church played a crucial role in undermining the institution of slavery. It provided sanctuary and support for escaped slaves, helping them integrate into free society. It also actively encouraged freeing of slaves, offering spiritual rewards and social recognition to those who freed their slaves. This created a moral and social pressure that gradually eroded the acceptance of slavery. Prominent church figures actively spoke out against the slave trade. Wulfstan, Bishop of Worcester, delivered fiery sermons denouncing the practice, urging his congregation to not sell men like beasts. Even Viking kings, once champions of the slave trade, began to embrace the new Christian values. Beyond political and religious shifts, economic forces also contributed to the decline. New trade routes, established by intrepid Viking explorers and merchants, crisscrossed Europe and beyond, offering alternative sources of wealth and labor. The new towns and cities, with their growing populations and demand for goods, offered new opportunities for trade and commerce. The Vikings, ever pragmatic, recognized the new opportunities presented by trade and gradually shifted their focus from plunder and slave raiding to commerce and exploration, explains historian Mary Valente. This shift in economic activity reduced the reliance on slave labor and contributed to the decline of the slave trade. The demand of slave labor dwindled as tenant farming and wage labor became more prevalent, Landowners, seeking to maximize their profits and minimize their risks, found it more economically viable to hire free laborers who were often more motivated and skilled than slaves. Even the Grógós, the legal code of Iceland, reflects this shift, with detailed provisions for hiring free laborers and drafting contracts. It states, "If a man hires another for work, they shall agree on the wages and the duration of service, and both shall be bound by their agreement," the law states, outlining the rights and obligations of both parties. Evolving moral and legal reforms also played a crucial role in the decline of the slave trade. While slavery persisted for some time, its legal foundations gradually eroded under the influence of Christian teachings and changing social attitudes. In 13th century Norway, King Magnus VI, known as the Lawmender, introduced laws restricting the sale of Christian slaves to pagans, reflecting a growing moral conscience and a desire to protect fellow Christians from the horrors of enslavement. The Heimskringla, a collection of sagas about the Norwegian kings, describes Magnus's legal reforms and his efforts to promote justice and fairness throughout his kingdom. These legal reforms, while not abolishing slavery outright, signaled a shift in attitudes and paved the way for further restrictions on the practice. The Church, with its unwavering commitment to human dignity and compassion, tirelessly advocated for the humane treatment of slaves and actively encouraged people to free their slaves. Monasteries and churches often provided sanctuary and support to those who escaped from slavery, helping them to build new lives as free individuals. The Church provided a refuge for runaway slaves and often facilitated their integration into free society, explains historian David Pelteret. This, combined with the changing economic and political landscape, gradually undermined the institution of slavery in the Viking world. The legacy of slavery in Dublin isn't confined to physical remains. It's etched into the very language and landscape of Dublin. Place names like Woodquay, derived from the Old Norse Kaupmanakay, meaning merchant's quay, hint at the bustling trade that once took place there, a trade that included human cargo. Diarmaid Murty, in the book The Languages of Ireland, states, "The Irish language absorbed words from Old Norse, some directly related to slavery. The word trail, meaning slave or bondman, is a direct borrowing from the Old Norse prel. These linguistic remnants remind us that the legacy of slavery is woven into the very fabric of Irish society." The social and cultural impacts of the slave trade are profound and far-reaching. The influx of slaves from diverse backgrounds, Irish, British, and even those from further afield, contributed to the cosmopolitan nature of Viking Dublin. It also led to intermarriage and cultural exchange, leaving a lasting impact on the genetic makeup and cultural identity of the Irish population. However, slavery also reinforced existing social hierarchies and contributed to the marginalization of certain groups. The stigma associated with slavery persisted long after its abolition, impacting the social and economic opportunities of those with slave ancestry. The legacy of slavery in Dublin is a reminder of the darkest chapters of human history, but it's also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring struggle for freedom and equality.